Hello, my name is Les Hins, Vice President of TPC International. The intent of this video is to give basic operator training to new drivers operating our Tireboss tire pressure control system. We're going to touch on operational and safety aspects of the system. We manufacture and distribute Tireboss systems from our facility here in Edmonton. The first component I'd like to mention is the operator control. It's mounted inside the cab of the truck in various locations depending on the cab style and model of truck. This is the valve control module. It's the place where the inflate and deflate takes place on the tires, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But first we'll move back to the drive wheels and the external hardwares. We've got a number of things. We've got a spring-loaded hanger in the center here, so it's got some flexibility should something grab the hose. Typically a lot of questions about the hoses and the durability. As precarious as they may look, they've been a very practical and very user-friendly method of hardware. And we've got a number of things here. As you see, the wheel end valves are actually in a closed position right now. There's one at each tire, so each individual tire actually has a wheel end valve on it. We recommend that these valves are shut off for parking if the truck is parked for an extended period of time. And before the driver starts up in the morning, we recommend that he comes and he actually opens these valves. If there happened to be a low tire or a leaky tire, you would hear the air transfer into that tire when you open the valves. So you would do this on all 8 tires on the other side of the truck as well. And again, if there's a leak, you would hear the air transfer. For wheel servicing, if you were to be changing an outside tire, for example, you would shut the wheel valves. Once you've closed the wheel valves, you would then remove this swivel fitting on the end of the hose right here. So it'll swivel off and the hose stays with the tire. The valve stems on the tires do not have the depressors in them. They're removed for clear airflow, so it's dependent on this valve being shut to retain the air in the tire. You would then have to take this compression fitting off right here and just move it out of the way, and then the wheel actually will come out over top of all this hardware. You don't have to remove any of the manifold and such. The question of tire chains comes up often. What the drivers do when they're applying chains is simply take these fittings, these 45 degrees, and they flare them out a little bit further to give the hose a little bit more clearance around the tire. So if you flare that one out and this one out, the hose will come out around here. And it's not an issue at all to apply the chains. You just take them, you throw them over top of the tires and around the hose. A lot of people have questioned taking these hoses off when chaining. It's not required to do that. One more note on the tire chains. When the chains are applied to the wheels, you have to run at the highest pressure setting. You don't want to take a chance of the sidewalls of the tires where the chains are coming in there making contact with each other. So the rule is if you put chains on, keep your tire pressures up. You can put the chains on when they're at a lower pressure and then reinflate, but don't run at low pressures with the chains on. Another thing to consider, if you're going into excessively deep mud, and we know these trucks do that, where they'll come up axle height into some ruts and mud, and in particular with chains on, if you're going to get into a real tough situation, not a bad idea to shut the wheel valves off. Set your tire pressures, that's open, but you want to close the valves like these are, and it's isolated from each other where basically if anything happened to any hardware, you're not going to lose any air from the tires, especially if you're in a situation where you can't stop because you're in such a bad hole. If the vehicle is equipped on the steer axle, there will be a shutoff valve at the frame rail. There will be one of these for each wheel. So this is again in the on position. That's closed as it should be for parking, and then reopened for normal operation. On the outside of the wheel here, we have a protective disc that we utilize in very rough service conditions to protect some of the hardware inside the wheel well itself. If the system is controlling the trailers, it has a supply line like this with a quick coupler supplying the air to and from the trailer tires back to the control box on the truck or the tractor. Back to the valve control on the side of the frame here. There are a number of things to take note of. On the side here, this line is actually the pressure port that goes to the tires. So this is tire pressure here, providing the wheel valves are open, of course. This Schrader valve is a central point if you were to want to fill the tires from this port. let's say you lost battery power for some reason and your tire pressure was low, you could actually take the Schrader off of here and with an external air supply actually fill the tires from this port. Another thing I'd like to mention, there's a strainer in here to catch any rubber fragments or debris that might come back from a tire. And what it does is it just catches large particles before they get into the exhaust valve, because the air actually comes back to this point and exhausts out the bottom of the box here. Recommended service on this is to do it with the oil changes, let's say every 300 hours, to go ahead and just pull the screen out of here, blow it clean, and put it back in. Taking note that the wheel valves have to be closed off because it's pressurized. So you'd actually close the wheel valves, drain the air out of the Schrader valve here, and then go ahead and pull the plug off of the strainer. The control valve is actually in cold climates like we're operating here in Canada. We have a thermostat on this valve measuring the temperature of the body, and it'll turn a heater on when it gets near the freezing point and regulate the temperature of the valve. We recommend on an annual basis actually to go in and put a kit into this valve. It's like servicing an air dryer. It's good preventive maintenance. Takes a couple hours to do max. Simple operation to ensure your system keeps working fine. Another normal practice would be to drain your wet tanks regularly, and on a daily basis go ahead and pull the truck cable drain as I am here and monitor that there's no moisture in there. If moisture starts to develop, that's an indication that your air dryers need to be serviced. The dryers in any event should be serviced in the late part of the summer going into the fall, rather than waiting until the winter when it might be too late if you had moisture in your system. So in this part of Canada, to do it in the month of September would be a reasonable time to service your air dryers. On the back of the controller there's actually a toggle switch to turn it off and on. The intent is that this switch is always in the on position. The control will come off and on with the ignition of the truck. So once the ignition's turned on, our toll-free number comes up so you can easily get a hold of us. And two warnings come up. The first one is the operator control must be on at all times while the vehicle is in motion or when it's moving. And the second warning is to ensure all the wheel valves are open at the wheels before operating the vehicle. Very important, both those messages, both those alerts. It tells us what application we're on, in this case a heavy load application. I'll explain more about that later. And the actual setting it's on right now is primary empty. The drives are going to 70 psi, and there's no overspeed monitored because we're in an empty condition on the highway with adequate tire pressure. It then goes into operation, as you see here, and the drives are actually okay at the set point of 70 psi. And that status will stay there until you want to change the pressure setting. In order to change pressures, you simply scroll up or down on these arrows on the left side of the controller. If you press any one of these arrows once, it simply tells you what setting you're on, and then reconfirms if there's an overspeed limit associated with that. In this case, there isn't on the primary empty. As you scroll up or down through these arrows, it'll actually show you the different settings that are in there, and you can just stop on whichever one you decide to utilize. So in this case, if I go up right to, let's say for example, a field loaded setting where the drives will change to 35 psi with a 14 km/h speed limit, and you can probably hear the deflate taking place, what's going to happen is the tires are going to deflate right down to the 35 psi set point that was programmed in there, which is a proper, appropriate pressure setting for that low speed in the field spraying applications in this case, below 14 km/h. Deflates are of course indicated by DEF on the controller, and it'll continue to deflate down. It happens fairly quickly. You do not need to wait for the pressure to change before you move the truck. You do all this while the vehicle is in motion, so it's not holding up the production of the truck in any way. The same holds true when you're into an inflate situation while the vehicle is moving. You can select the inflate and let it do its thing as you continue to operate the truck. We're almost there. We're down to 36, now 35 psi. The exhaust valve has closed. It quit deflating. You'll see some stabilization of pressure, and for it to rise on its own like this is not unusual. What it does is it's stabilizing in pressure between the actual tire pressure and the point at where we're sensing the air pressure. So during the deflate, there's a bit of a differential on this, and it'll cycle or kick in a number of times before it actually stabilizes. The upper tolerance is 5 psi above the set point. As you see, when it gets to 40, it'll kick in another deflate. And if the pressure were to drop 2 psi below the set point, it would then reinflate it back to the set point. In order to throw it into an inflate, we can scroll back to another setting, and in this case, let's go to a empty setting, secondary empty, let's say 45 psi. 85 kilometers an hour is the speed limit here in this case, and it's thrown itself into an inflate, and the tire pressure will now start to inflate up to that set point. I'd like to talk a little bit about the overspeed function on the system. In this case, the secondary empty setting at 45 pounds has an overspeed limit of 85 kilometers an hour. And if the driver or the truck manages to hit that overspeed limit, it'll come up in the controller with a warning telling him he's going too fast for the setting. This warning appears on the screen. This is it here. It says overspeed condition, maximum speed 85 kilometers an hour, telling him to slow down or change the setting. That warning will come up at preset intervals to warn the driver with a beep each time, as you see here. And if he continues to operate the vehicle continuously in an overspeed condition for 30 seconds, it will then come up and tell him that the control system is changing the setting, and it's done it there. It's changed to the primary empty setting, and it will automatically start to inflate the tires. Another function built into the controller is the dimming function for nighttime operation. If you press the dim function here, it reduces the glare of the text here for a nighttime operation, and it illuminates all the white text on the control box so you can see it and operate it at night. In the operator control guide, we reference a sequence for changing between applications, which is changing between the various pages of pressures that are available. And this is in the control guide, so you can, or the operator guide, so you can look at it after you're in operation with the truck. But you go into the menu, and you hit enter because you want to be able to change the application. It happens to be on heavy load 2 there. If you don't select or enter another selection, it just goes back into operation. So I'll come back into menu, I'll hit enter, and I'll say I want to change that to application 1, which is a different set of pressures, and I'll hold this until it beeped there, and it's now loaded into or operating on a different set of pressures, which are listed in the back of your control guide. Then it sits there and it wants you to accept the setting that it's on. It wants you to reconfirm that that setting is actually what you want. And when you hit enter in there, it will accept it and go into operation. So now we're actually operating on that other setting. And if I go down to the setting we were at before, sorry, I'll go this way, to the field loaded, you see it's now at 30 psi where it used to be at 35. So we're running on a different set of pressures. Same type of speed limit. In this case, it just happened to be a bit of a lighter load, and it'll deflate now to that new set point of 30 psi, which is on that particular application. I'd like to talk a little bit about the operator guide. This guide is installed into each truck when each system is installed on the unit. The front of the cover describes the various buttons that are displayed on the front of the controller and what the function of each is. It also has our contact details, our toll-free line, for example, to our office here in Edmonton. On the inside of the guide, what we have is the description of the startup sequence, going into normal operation from there, a bit of a description on the trailer circuit override. This is the function of the system to override a trailer valve control if for some reason your normal trailers that were equipped are not being pulled by the truck. So it would be pulling a set of trailers without the Tireboss tire pressure control. Changing the setting gives the description on the normal operation. This description talks about changing through the preset pressures that are programmed into the controller. On to changing the application. This is referencing the various pages of pressures that are available to you, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And of course, the safety warnings that are involved, the different alerts that may come up on the controller, very important to understand those. I'd like to give a bit of a description on the various settings, the various pressures that are available to the driver. This is actually the chart that's on the back of the operator control guide. This chart, as you see, has the ability for anywhere between 1 and 8 settings to be programmed into the controller. This is dependent on what the application is, what the configuration is, and what we're trying to achieve with the control of the tire pressures. These various settings are programmable. We can do these in various languages because we can change the text that's in each of these boxes. We can also change the sequence of the settings to fit your application. The pressures that are programmed into here are determined by deflections of the tires in conjunction with the appropriate speed that they're operating at. So the two things determining the tire pressure are the load of the vehicle and the speed that it's traveling at. The normal sequence in this case for this is an oil field land spraying vacuum truck. For his normal cycle, he'd be operating on the first setting if he's on the primary highway in an empty condition. The tire pressure is at 70 psi. That deflection of the tire at 70 psi is appropriate for normal highway speeds. We're not monitoring the overspeed at all. If he then were to travel onto a secondary road or any situation where he's now still in the empty condition operating below 85 kilometers per hour, he can safely operate at 45 pounds of tire pressure. This reduction in pressure has benefits to the ride characteristics of the vehicle, braking traction, as well as to tire life. It's bringing the deflection where it should be under those operating conditions. As he goes through the various pressures here, he may go into a least loaded condition with the pressure setting here at 40 psi with a lower speed limit up to 19 kilometers an hour. So he's loaded here, restricted in how fast he can travel. Not unusual to be on a secondary road in conditions running up to 80 kilometers per hour, and in this case running at 75 pounds of tire pressure. In a primary loaded application, so highway loaded at highway speeds, we would then be bringing the vehicle tire pressure back up to its normal maximum tire pressure of 100 psi. This is the big one in land spraying operations, is to be in the field loaded setting in the land spraying operations at 35 pounds of tire pressure, restricted at a low speed of 14 kilometers per hour. The various applications that we talk about that are available to the driver are really referencing the different pages of pressures. If you look at this as one particular page of pressures, and we happen to call this application 2. We've named it heavy load. It's for a situation where, for instance, he may not be on a public road structure coming out of a lease directly into a farm field and with higher loads than normal. So let's say he's back into a situation where he's on public roads and he's at legal highway weights. We want him to be able to get back to a set of pressures appropriate for that weight structure. So we have available to the driver another page of pressures. We call this application 1, and in this case normal load. And there are slight variations to this set of pressures in the loaded pressures. Here we're at 40 psi and as low as field loaded at 30 psi, whereas on the other page we were at 35. I'd also like to mention that there are 6 available applications or pages of pressures as an option to put into the controller. Typically anywhere between 1 to 4 to 6 are used, and they're all inserted into the back of the operator control guide. Whether you're in an oil field application, logging application, or concrete application, the text that's described in the boxes here is really how you follow the control of the system. For a logging application, it may be quite different than this, as a concrete application would be different. But if you follow what it says in the text, you'll be operating the system correctly. Aside from continuous monitoring and control of the tire pressures, there are a number of alerts that may appear on the screen of the control unit. In this case, we're looking at the low air supply warning. What that warning indicates is that the brake tank pressure on the truck has dropped below 75 psi. So if the brake system pressure drops, our system becomes inactive. The Tireboss will still continue to display the tire pressures, but it won't allow an inflate or deflate until the brake tank pressure rises again to approximately 90 psi or better. and then the lower supply warning will go away. This warning only shows up again by brake application or use of brake pressure, and we're just giving the brake system priority. One other very important alert I'd like to discuss is the tire pressure loss warning. This warning comes on if there's ever a tire pressure loss that the system can't keep up with, so a catastrophic type of air loss. If this warning comes up onto the controller, what you need to do is stop the vehicle, and we'll simulate that pressure loss by removing the orange hose at the drive axles of this truck. Now I'm going to simulate the tire pressure loss that I was talking about by removing this orange hose here. All the wheel valves are open as they normally would be when you're operating the vehicle, so all 8 tires are open. And when I remove this and cause a catastrophic pressure loss, we'll show you what happens on the controller. And the system immediately kicks into an inflate as the pressure dropped. If the pressure continues to drop while it's in an inflate, the tire pressure loss comes up on the controller, and it tells you to, of course, where it is on the drives or trailers, for example. And it will also tell you to stop the vehicle now. If this warning comes on, you cannot continue to operate the vehicle. You have to stop it. As you see, the air is coming out from all 8 tires, so you have to shut each individual wheel valve. As you can still hear, the air was still coming from these set of tires over to the T on the other side, so you have to close all 8 tires. That's complete and everything is isolated from any air loss. There are a couple possibilities that can cause that kind of a tire pressure loss warning. For example, a tire blowout. If, for example, this inside wheel blew, you would simply shut that one tap off. And you would isolate the leak. If it's something like we have here, if we were to break this hose, or more likely if anything breaks here, it would be this fitting up at the T, which is up in here. This is probably the weak point of the system if something did manage to snag the hose. We very often supply a little kit that goes into the truck, which has all the spare parts that you might see on the outside of the wheels here. So in this kit are the brass fittings, the orange hose, some of the miscellaneous parts that are on the outside, as well as even some wheel hoses in case while you're servicing wheels you happen to break something. This wrench fits right onto the rotary union, and you put a bar, another wrench in here to loosen the union from the manifold. If you have any breakage or a tire pressure loss of any sort, there's significant time to allow yourself to stop the truck and come out and identify it. We've taken probably the course of a minute to come out and isolate the leak on these tires, and as you see, there's still lots of air in the tires. So it's not like the hose breaks and all the tires go flat. There's a large volume that is being dealt with, and there's significant time involved. One more item I'd like to discuss is the natural heat buildup or heat generation that takes place in tires as vehicles are operating down the highway, in particular with a full load. For example, 100 psi set point, it is not unusual to see that pressure climb on its own, let's say to 105, 170, even 108 psi on a hot summer day where you would normally see this kind of pressure rise. So that's a normal thing, nothing to be concerned about. One last item I'd like to discuss is the importance of full utilization of the system throughout the haul cycle. It's really important that you run, for example, on the highway empty and off-highway empty settings, and then coming out of the slow speed areas when you're in a loaded condition, to actually utilize all those settings, because if you do, you'll see the benefits in the tire life, the better lower vehicle maintenance, the less driver fatigue, the better ride the driver experiences, less compaction, less running, all those type of benefits that are realized by using the system. If you only use it when you're stuck, for one thing, you've done a lot of damage, it's probably too late, and you're not getting all the benefits that the system has to offer. Thank you for viewing this video. We hope you don't hesitate to get a hold of us. We're very open to your calls and comments and questions, and hope you don't hesitate at all to get a hold of us. And we wish you success operating our Tireboss system. Thank you.